Hello everybody and welcome to today's IEP Live Learn Lunch. This is our 83rd IEP Live Learn Lunch and we're really excited today to be joined by John Bishop, Managing Director of Evolve Education, and he's going to be taking us through today's presentation. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over. But before I do, I'm just going to remind you all, please keep using the chat, share your thoughts and contributions and any questions that you've got for John, because we will have time at the end. So thank you very much, John, and over to you.
Great, thanks, Helen. Before I start my spiel, can you all hear me? Anyone stick thumbs up maybe in your, yeah, there we go, perfect.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Thank you for taking time to listen to this. Hopefully there'll be some things in here that you'll find useful and interesting. It's certainly something that's quite new because everybody I'm talking to about this project is fascinated by the science and some of the evidence that sits behind it. And I've got quite a lot of slides here to run through. So hopefully you'll stick with me till the end and there will be some time for questions. So hopefully in the next 45 minutes or so, I'm going to try and cover the following 3 points here. So we'll start off just by talking about neurocognitive training and what this actually means. We'll talk about some challenges, but also opportunities for our sector, because this hasn't been used in this sector just yet. And I do have some case studies at the end where we've successfully applied the theory and some of the scientific principles in the education sector and in the employment sector. So hopefully we'll be able to draw some parallels from that and see how we can apply this learning into our own work. So to kick things off then, what is neurocognitive training? So the neuro part to this comes from neurology. So anything to do with the brain and the spinal cord. And you'll hear me refer to brain health quite a lot today. And I know it's a phrase that people are starting to use more often now, but I'm going to go into some detail with what a healthy brain actually looks like. Now, a disclaimer at the beginning here, I'm not a neuroscientist, but I have had the good fortune of spending a lot of my time with a pretty eminent neuroscientist. So he keeps telling me one day he'll bestow upon me an honorary PhD from his lab, but I'm certainly not a scientist. So if any scientists are in the room, please don't embarrass me with your scientific questions because I'll probably struggle. But we'll talk a little bit about brain health today. And the cognitive element you're probably more familiar with, which is all to do with how we acquire knowledge and understanding. And hopefully by the end of today's webinar, if nothing else, you'll understand how those two are explicitly linked. You can't have one without the other. So that's the background, but the gentleman I referred to is Professor Michael Mursnick. Now, some of you may be familiar with him. I know he's on the syllabus for A-level psychology. So some people are familiar with Michael and his work, but anybody in the world of neuroscience will regard Michael as the founding father of neuroplasticity. So about 50 years ago, the neuroscience community thought that the brain stopped developing as soon as you reached early adulthood. And it was the start of that slippery slope down towards cognitive decline and old age. But Michael convinced them otherwise. And the monkey on the screen wouldn't get through ethical approval, I don't think, nowadays, but the experiments that Michael did to prove that the brain can continue to develop, adapt, and grow at any age if the stimuli is correct. It was conducted using monkeys. So that's Professor Michael Mursnick, and he's not just an inspiration for this work, but he's an active contributor to it. I had a call with Mike. We have monthly check-ins, and as we do, find out what he's up to. He's a great guy. He's really modest, but he did drop into the conversation. He'd just been to the White House. He'd been advising on the evolution of the Human Genome Project, which links to mapping of the brain and neural networks. So just to drop a name into his conversation, I'm doing the same into this conversation here. And one of the things that Michael's most famous for is the Cochlear ear implant, which is an amazing piece of technology, but it's the neuroscience that sits behind the technology, which is really powerful. Anybody who knows somebody who's had a cochlear ear implant fitted will tell you that the first 2 to 3 weeks after it's been implanted, they just hear noise. It doesn't work. And the reason why it works is because within that 2 to 3 week period, the brain is rapidly remapping and remodeling itself. What's actually happened is that the implant has bypassed the damaged parts of the inner ear So it goes straight to the cochlear, and then the electrical impulses that go through, translated by the brain into not just noise, but sound and words and language that can be understood. And it's the same principles that are behind the cochlear ear implants that I'm talking to you about today. And we're making available to students, children, young people, and adults in the workplace as part of this project. Michael also, as well as being the founding father of neuroplasticity, he also won the Kavli Prize in 2016 for his services to neuroscience. But I went onto their website because I'd heard this mentioned before, and I thought it was relevant to the webinar today. His Nobel, it's the equivalent of the Nobel Prize for neuroscience, but the Kavli Prize was awarded for the discovery of mechanisms that allow experience and neural activity to remodel brain function. And that's really relevant to the conversation today, because some of you may be joining the call with a degree of skepticism, and certainly Google will give you a lot of skepticism around this whole field. And I'll explain some of the reasons for that a little bit later. But not many of the other contributors in this space have got a Kavli Prize for what's on the screen there. Now, this is, apologies from me early on, because this is probably the busiest slide I've got to show you. But I wanted to put this on screen because this is a slide that Michael used when he came over to London. He was in England before COVID. He was on a whistle-stop tour around the country delivering keynotes and meeting various people. And I had the pleasure of spending the full week with him. And it was only towards the end of the week when I suggested that he put these notes down on a slide. Michael's very good at delivering lectures. You may have seen his TED Talk. And as a translational neuroscientist, he's pretty good. But still, he gets into the jargon a little bit too easily. And it's something that's second nature to him. But to a layperson like me, it's new. And I didn't quite understand what he meant when he talked about a healthy brain. So he talks about 30 or 40 different health factors that are all improved or degraded in unison. What that means is you very rarely get a brain that's physically healthy but nutritionally poor. All of these brain health factors improve or deteriorate together. And this is what Michael does with his science and his technology. So if we go back to the earlier slide and talk about neurocognitive training, there's nothing in here which really talks about cognition. This is all to do with the neurological health of the brain, which is a pretty important organ, I think we'll all agree. And I'm just going to pick out a couple of things in here. So integrity of the blood-brain barrier. So if you go for a night out and have a few too many to drink, you'll find that your blood-brain barrier is probably not as impermeable as it should be. And that's something which can be improved with training. And it isn't just something that can be improved in childhood, where neuroplasticity in the brain adapts fastest. It can be improved at any age. Another one which I just wanted to highlight is around brain chemistry and the balance of neurotransmitters. I'm not going to go into too much detail with mental health today, although it is going to be referenced. And a lot of the drugs and the pharmaceutical interventions are associated with rebalancing neurotransmitter levels. So with bipolar and schizophrenia, it's to do with serotonin. And I know serotonin is a feel-good hormone, neurotransmitters are not a hormone, but it's something which isn't always good. You can have too much of it. But what those drugs are doing are artificially rebalancing the levels in the brain and the nervous system. When what Michael's proven, and the evidence backs this up, over 150 randomized control trials, this can be done naturally. So in improving the health of the brain, improved mental health will be a byproduct, and so will improve cognition. So when we talk about healthy brains, these are the factors that we're looking at. And this is what Michael's built his career upon. There's a couple of things on this slide here that are relevant. So Michael set up his first company, or he was asked to advise as the Chief Scientific Officer for Fast Forward. And Fast Forward, as it's pronounced, is helping struggling readers to acquire language skills much quicker. And that was an early version of what we're now using with students in schools that we work with. BrainHQ is the main project that Michael's famous for, out in San Francisco, Composite Science. They were leaders in this field. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the high-profile clients that they've got. And I will refer back to BrainHQ because that's the software application that we're using as part of this project. But the Stronger Brains reference beneath that that's quite relevant because it explains how we first met Professor Mursnick and why he was so interested in our work. I know at the start I didn't really introduce Evolve Education and what we do, but we were responsible for creating the health mentor role within compulsory education. So we recruit, employ, train and deploy health mentors to work with the most vulnerable children in, originally was mainstream schools, but now we're doing more work with alternative provision centres, people referral units, children's trusts, virtual schools, children in care. And Michael had tried to do this type of work with vulnerable students in America and Australia, but his original model was to train teachers. But he ran into a few problems there because we all know how busy teachers are in schools. But he came across our health mentor workforce and thought, well, there's an organisation here that's doing 90% of the heavy lifting. We're building those relationships, the rapport with the young people. And on top of that, he gave us a tool to be able to objectively assess the impact that we're having, but also give us the extra edge when it comes to this neurocognitive training. And that was about 4 years ago, and we've developed a number of pilot programs, we've established different markets, but now we're focusing our efforts on the employability sector. So this is the start of the journey for us in this space, but it's the continuation of a journey that started about 4 years ago with Professor Mursnick. When we talk about the software, this is an example of the game. So this is a screenshot from BrainHQ. And this is a game called Double Decision, which is one of the most evidenced neurocognitive exercise games out there. And what happens is very quickly, an image is flashed on screen and there'll be two different vehicles in the center. One's got a roof, one hasn't, but those vehicles change depending on the difficulty level. And at the same time, the Route 66 sign flashes in the periphery. And this is it's a cognitive training game where you have to focus, use your attention skills, and also processing this is a visual processing exercise. So you have to remember which vehicle flashed up in the screen. Is it the roof or without the roof? And where was the Route 66 logo? Now, this is one of 29 exercises within BrainHQ. And altogether, there are 776 unique difficulty levels. And the $50 million that was spent to develop this product over the last 15 years, a lot of it's gone into the AI and the machine learning in the background, so that you're always operating in your training threshold. And what that means is you're going to get 20% wrong, because if it's something that you're getting right all of the time, it's not doing it, you're just wasting your time. You might be enjoying yourself, but it's not triggering those neuroplastic adaptations that we're talking about. And this training threshold is one of the reasons why crossword puzzles and Sudoku and things like that don't always have a positive impact on your brain health and your cognitive skills. For example, if you're doing a crossword puzzle that's too easy or a crossword puzzle that's too difficult, it's not serving its purpose. This is why technology gives us an added advantage, because you can really fine-tune the difficulty levels to match your training threshold. And that's what BrainHQ is as effective as it is. This next slide here, I think this one's a video. So this will give us, keep an eye on those three globes there. You can see this is one of the easy levels, but it does get more difficult quite quickly. I'll probably challenge your cognitive skills here to listen whilst you're watching what's on the screen, but this is now 5 globes to try and track. This is another visual processing activity. And all of these games last about 2.5 minutes in total. And I'll talk about some of the neuroplastic rules that are associated with this and how much training is actually required for it to be effective. You can see here that the object in the foreground blending a little bit more with the background. So it does get more challenging as you progress through the games. Now, the brain's a pretty big deal, and that's why improving your brain health delivers a whole host of different outcomes. And most of these on screen here are health related, but there are a couple in here which are more focused on performance. There's one study called the ACTIVE study, which is probably the most high profile study when it comes to the whole world of cognitive training and neurocognitive training in particular. And the ACTIVE study was a longitudinal study, and it's ongoing. So the 20-year mark is close upon us. And what this study did, it looked at an older population, so they're 55 years upwards, and they were trying to see if training with BrainHQ alongside other similar interventions would delay the onset of dementia. And they found that double decision, the game that you just saw, plus a couple of others, did significantly delay the onset of dementia. And it was a randomized controlled trial. It was independent, over 3,000 participants. But the real fascinating aspect of this project is that the participants only had to do 10 hours of training with BrainHQ to notice the difference. But staggeringly, 10 years later, the benefit of that training was still there. Now, that's quite profound. And it really took me some time to understand this, because I thought that BrainHQ would become like a pharmaceutical intervention, where you have to find time in your day, every single week, the rest of your life, to keep your cognition sharp. That's not the case. I'm going to talk about that in a few moments' time, and I've got a different slide which I think stresses the point a little bit better. But this concept of brain health, you can see here the wide-ranging benefits. And the reason why there are so many randomized control trials is because every time it's applied in a different setting, somebody wants to see evidence of impact. And that's why Michael used to run the lab at University of California in San Francisco, where he's a professor emeritus there. A lot of his former students have gone on to do their own work all across the globe. And wherever they go, and whenever they test anything to do with brain health, they will use BrainHQ as either the assessment tool or the training tool. And that's why that research base is growing all of the time. On the BrainHQ website, you'll see some interesting partnerships that they've got. But you can see some of the clients on here. So we've got, from the health side, we've got insurers and providers like the Mayo Clinic and the Cleveland Clinic. Employers, Nestle out in Japan. BrainHQ has been translated into, don't quote me on this, but I think about 8 or 9 different languages, and Japanese is one of them. And this is to help keep people in the workplace for longer. I know Japanese culture is all about respect and how they treat their elderly population. So that's aligned with the work that BrainHQ has been doing with them. But interestingly, Composite Science's biggest client is the American government. They purchase 2 million licenses every year. So anybody who's in the US Armed Forces, whether it's Air Force, Army, Marines, you get access to this. And the same software that those armed forces are using is the same software that we're giving to 10-year-olds in schools in inner city Birmingham or inner city London. And they're using it for 3 main reasons. The first one is performance. Obviously, they're in a pretty demanding role. So if they are in a conflict situation, their speed of thought, processing, field of view, everything needs to be at its peak. So that's the first reason why they're using it. The second reason is because mental health is a challenge in the armed forces. And the third reason, it's to do with recovery from things like PTSD. And there was a recent study called the BRAVE study, where people, war vets had been suffering for a number of years with traumatic brain injuries as a result of concussion or blast explosions nearby. That's another reason why they're given access to BrainHQ. So you can see there's a whole range of different clients there. And our friend Tom Brady, then if you're into the American football, NFL star Tom Brady, 44 years of age, still performing at the top level. And I think this week, I don't know, I think it was a record for the furthest distance in terms of passing the American football. So that's another record he's broken. But he actually went on record and talked about how he's been using BrainHQ and how it's helped his performance. And initially, he was using this to try and recover from concussion sooner. But he noticed that a couple of things happened when he was playing. So his decision-making was better. He was able to think a lot clearer and quicker. And one of the things that he was, I was going to say famous for, but probably infamous for, was forgetting the plays. So in American football, you get information from your coach, and your coach tells you what the next play is, and you have to remember and who's moving where and what you're supposed to be passing the ball to. And he used to forget that quite regularly. But he noticed the difference from using BrainHQ. So he's gone on record and not just talked about how he uses it, but he's actually now gone into business with Composite Science as part of his TB12 brand to try and introduce it to more elite sports stars. So you can see that there's a huge range of different benefits and potential clients for this neurocognitive focus. But that's one of its biggest challenges. And one of the biggest challenges it's got is that it doesn't have a specific area where it has a strength. So people can't always put it into a particular box and understand, yeah, it's for ADHD, it's for Alzheimer's, it's for elite sports performance. And that's one of the challenges that Michael tells me Positive faced since they started over 15 years ago. Now, all this sounds very positive, but is it a magic bullet? And the answer is no. There are obvious environmental and social determinants which we need to look after first. If somebody is still in a situation where they're highly stressed, they've got a poor diet, they're not exercising regularly enough, all of those things will contribute to an unhealthy brain. So no, it's not a magic bullet. You can't rewrite a bad lifestyle just with playing a few computer games. It doesn't work that way. But one of the other real challenges with this is that for these neuroplastic adaptations to occur, it requires conscious effort. And although I mentioned a threshold of 10 hours earlier with the active study, Michael actually suggests 30 hours is what you'd like to see. And he's asking us to try and achieve 30 hours in every one of our programs. And this isn't logged on time. This is actual training time. So you could be logged on to the system for 15 minutes, but in those 15 minutes, you only do 10 minutes of actual training. The other 5 minutes is selecting the game, logging in, looking at your scores, but 20 plus hours of training time that's needed for those changes to occur. And 20 hours, look, sounds okay, but let's try and break it down into what it means. This needs to be done over a 12-week period, really, so it's quite intensive. So if you think about 20 hours over a 12-week period, it's 100 minutes every single week. So 7 days a week, you've got to devote 15 minutes of your life to this. Now, if you're Tom Brady and you're an elite sports person or high-powered chief exec or someone who's got a high degree of self-motivation, that's probably okay. But let's think about our clients and the people that we're working with. More of a challenge. This is also what we face when we've been working with vulnerable children in schools. We need to build this software and this science around an implementation model which will be effective. And that's why the application of this is very different in a primary school setting to an apprenticeship setting to a workplace. Every different setting has its own model. And we're in the early stages of developing this for the employability sector. Another way of looking at the 20-hour challenge is you could do 30 minutes a day, 3 days a week for 12 weeks. So it depends what fits in best. And I've gone through 2 pretty intensive programs with BrainHQ myself. I started off in about the 65th percentile. It's all age ranked. There's millions of people in the database. So it's all ranked by age because your cognitive performance generally declines with age. But I was in about the 65th percentile, and now I've got up to the 82nd percentile after about 3 years of training. But it's not 3 years of intensive training. I've done 2 3-month programs where it has been intensive, where I found it was easier to do it daily. I did 15 minutes a day at lunch every single day, got through it. Sometimes you might slip a day, but you catch up then later in the week. And now I'm just doing it on a maintenance basis. So once in a while, so maybe 2 or 3 times a week, I'll just pick it up and go to one of the games that I'm not very good at, or one of the games I enjoy most, and I'll just do some top-ups. But it's a 3-month, that 12-week training period, which is the key focus of our work. I wanted to pick up on that earlier comment I mentioned about the brain health and how it's really important that we view this slightly differently to working out our muscles. And that's why we've got a brain here lifting some dumbbells. I do go to the gym. I do try and do my bit and stay healthy, but I'm not lifting these heavy weights and grunting and dropping weights on the floor and trying to get big muscles. I'm doing the easy things like, I don't know, treadmill, maybe a bit of a rowing machine. But those guys who lift the heavy weights and the girls who lift the heavy weights in the gym, they have to do that if they want to maintain their physique. Because if they stop lifting those weights, their muscle will atrophy. It's a similar adaptation at play, but it's the muscles responding to the stimuli rather than the brain responding. But you don't lift heavy, well, most people don't lift those heavy weights in everyday life. So you have to maintain that stimuli and that stress on the muscle to maintain that physique. Now, this is where the penny dropped for me when I was with Michael, and he gave this presentation for about the 10th time. And it quickly dawned on me why the 3-month training period is all that's needed. Because once you've elevated the brain and you've had that, let's call it a vaccine, you've given it that boost, you'll continue to operate at that elevated state during everyday interactions. So even now, here I am talking on this webinar here, I'm using all of my cognitive skills, visual processing, I'm using my language skills, but I'm working at an elevated state than 3 years ago. So you're constantly using those new skills, and it's maintaining that status. So it's very different to working out physically. When you're working out cognitively and neurologically, once you've got yourself to that higher level, it will be maintained quite easily. Now, to pick up on the earlier points, if we're working with children and young people and they're in a traumatic home life, or there's some situations which are outside of their control, that's important because you need to make sure that that's addressed. But the key point to make here is that with your clients, you may only need to do a 12-week program, and that could be enough to set them up for potentially the next 10 years. And that's why this really is quite profound. I did want to just pick up on some of the controversy that around this whole field. So you can probably see that Professor Mursnick, he's got his credentials and he's coming at this from a neurological perspective as opposed to a cognitive perspective. If you pick up your phone now and go to the App Store or what's the one called? The App Store, Google Play, if it's an Android phone, and you start searching for these cognitive training tools, you'll see things like Luminosity, one called Peak, one called Learning RX. Lots of them have got 5 stars. Now, that's a review from a customer. It's not a review from a scientific community. And most of these cognitive training tools don't work. And that's really important to note. If you were to do a literature review, you will see that the summary is cognitive training is ineffective, because in 99% of cases, that's true. In 2015, the FTC, I think it's the Federal Trade Commission in America, there was a lawsuit, and most of them got hit with multi-million-dollar fines because they couldn't back up their marketing claims. BrainHQ and a similar product called Cognifit, based out of New York, they were the only 2 that were unscathed because they had evidence to substantiate everything they talk about in their marketing. So it's really important that that context is taken into account when you do your own due diligence and start looking at these products that are on the market. The BBC as well, they didn't do a very good job with this back in 2015 because they did a documentary, and there was an Oxford researcher that did a similar study of their own, but they only required participants to do 2 hours of training as opposed to our 20 that we're recommending. And the games that we developed, they were developed over a short period of time, whereas the 29 exercises in BrainHQ, they've been developed over a long period of time. Lots of research has been contributing to them. So it is a very nuanced subject, but there is a lot of controversy out there about whether or not this is effective. So I just wanted to mention that because it's certainly not a magic bullet, and there's certainly a lot of bad actors in this space, which has made it difficult for those that do have evidence of their effectiveness. So this is all very nice, but what does it mean for us in our context? And this is where some of the other points in the webinar description are relevant, because I'm going to talk a little bit about learned helplessness here, because I think that's a key subject that we're wrestling with our clients quite often. Now, this next slide talks about benefits of improving your cognition in the workplace. Now, certainly it will help you get a job, and it should help you maintain a job and maybe get promoted or find a better job. But again, these aren't really the barriers that I would say are the top 3 priorities that you're working on with your clients. So yes, these things will happen as part of this work, but alongside that, relationships matter. And this is the reason why Michael first found our organisation, because, as he said, we do 90% of the work. And you've got to make sure that relationship is there before you can start doing any of this. And I would suggest that if you're working with clients, you've already got that rapport. If you introduce something like neurocognitive training, they'll trust you and they'll want to do it. And the point at the bottom, actually, I'm not sure if we cover that in any of the later slides, but this concept of supportive accountability, it's something that's becoming more and more common in the world of health tech, med tech, ed tech. Lots of these software solutions are great. I don't know anything like me. You'll download something to your phone. You might use it for the first couple of times and then you forget about it. So the concept of having somebody as an accountability partner. So if you make something like this available to a client, making sure that you're checking in with them regularly to check they're keeping up with their training schedule. So learned helplessness is something that I think is really relevant, and if I was to try and pick out something that I think will be most helpful in this sector, I would suggest that it's this work of originally Martin Seligman, wasn't it, back in 1967 when he first coined the phrase. And it's associated with all sorts of different outcomes, but neuroscience is really relevant in here. As part of their early work on this subject, they realised that there was this concept of self-talk, and some people were more helpless than others, and they found that those that were more helpful had certain ways of talking to themselves. So the first thing they'd do is, if there was something that was going wrong in their life, they wouldn't say, well, that's everything in my life. They would maybe attribute it just to that particular situation, so it'd be specific rather than global. Also, it would be external rather than internal. A lot of people have this habit of saying, well, it's just me, it's just my luck. But actually, if you can attribute something to an external factor, it starts making you feel a little bit more in control and helpful rather than helplessness. Now, these are the concepts that Seligman and his colleague, his collaborator called Mayer, they went on and studied this a bit further, and Mayer went on to become a neuroscientist himself and actually found out what was going on in the brain when somebody was having these feelings of learned helplessness. And it's actually a part of the brainstem just at the top there, the dorsal raphe nucleus. And it's a bit like the fight or flight response, but it certainly triggers anxiety. And when somebody's feeling out of control, and it could be trying to find a job, for example, or they may have depression, they're not seeing a way out of this negative cycle, it triggers feelings of helplessness. But it can be overcome with the positive self-talk that their research suggested. And the reason for that is because there's a part of the prefrontal cortex that links with that DRN, and there's a circuit. And that's why they realized after 50 years, their initial concept of learned helplessness was actually wrong. You don't learn to become helpless, you learn to become helpful. The default state is helplessness, but what actually happens is that through learning, control and helpfulness. So that's why the webinar title was phrased as learn helpfulness rather than helplessness. And that circuit, they've given it the name the hope circuit, which is all to do with learned optimism. And specifically in relation to the work that we're talking about here, there are two angles for us. The first one is to teach clients about this, to teach them how to overcome this anxiety that they're feeling, this concept of learned helplessness. And the second thing, let's strengthen it. We now know that there's a circuit and there are parts of the brain that are connected, and we need to break that cycle so that people don't feel helpless and they feel more in control. And the concept of learning control is the theme that runs throughout that work. What have we done about that? Well, this is an online course we created, and it's trying to help our users when it comes to getting that 20 hours of training in. But it's really fundamental that they understand the reasons why they're doing the training. Because if you just tell them to do it and they don't understand how it's going to work or what the benefits will be, they're not going to be behind it. They're not going to have that buy-in and that engagement. So we created this online course to teach people about their brain. There's elements of neuroeducation in there, but those concepts of positive psychology. So Seligman stuff's in there. We've got Albert Bandura and self-efficacy. And the good thing about this course, it's not accredited, it's not assessed. There are some activities in there, but it's not a pass or fail. And somebody said to me, it's like when you download an app, you could get a PDF document or an instruction manual. This is a 12-week instruction manual to get the most out of BrainHQ. 12 modules, each of the modules about an hour and a half long, and each of the 29 exercises in BrainHQ is broken down, how it works, what you need to do, and fundamentally what you can do outside in the real world, so not on a computer screen, to improve your brain health. So there are aspects of well-being in there. You've got diet, for example, why the omega-3s are helpful. And we teach people about the brain and why the myelin sheaths surrounding the axons, 90% fatty. So if you don't have enough fat in your diet, you're not going to be able to have good communication between all your neural circuits. And there's a link there all the time back to the brain and how it's organically becoming healthier. Now, the concept of near and far transfer is a scientific principle which talks about how effective any of these interventions are. So near transfer is when the training that you do can be transferred across to something which is similar or related. So for example, if we're training working memory in BrainHQ, if you then give the students a different memory assessment, it should show that they've got better at working memory. That's the fundamental principle of near transfer. And most applications that are worth their salt can demonstrate near transfer. Far transfer is when it becomes impactful in your everyday life. And all of the studies that BrainHQ have published and that have been published about BrainHQ by independent researchers, they all talk about improvements in cognition, confidence, mental health, and self-regulation. And these are byproducts of a healthier brain. And I would suggest that the clients that we're working with could all benefit. That's my hypothesis. But it's not a magic bullet. We need to find a model, and we need to find a way of them getting 20 hours in so they're fully engaged and they understand what's happening inside their brain as they're doing this work. I'm just going to give you a couple of examples of how we've done this in the education sector. So the first of them, this here was a college cohort, and we're talking 16 to 18-year-olds. And we did an initial assessment. And these assessments, by the way, they're fascinating. So we can do an assessment. Yes, we're assessing cognitive skills because they're a proxy. So if you've got good cognitive skills, generally you'd have good brain health. And Michael and his team can analyze the data and they can say, well, this is what part of the brain that is the problem. This is fascinating when we share the results with teachers or tutors, because we can tell them straight away. It's quite small on my screen here. The second from the right, the one who's got the lowest profile. It doesn't break it down into the specific cognitive domains because this is a composite score. We could probably say that student there is going to struggle with their assessments. And without having any prior knowledge of the students, we know who's potentially going to get the higher grades when it comes to their exams. As a profession, I don't think educators know enough about the brain, because we're only now learning through EEGs and some of the new modern technologies. We're only now learning about some of the details that can be shared to improve educational outcomes. But this is an initial assessment result in a college, and the college were blown away by some of the insights that we provided. But looking at two students here, the column on the right-hand side shows the composite score. So this is the aggregate of all of the different cognitive exercises and assessments that were part of the battery. And they're very similar, but you can see how the profiles are totally different. So these two students have both come out around, I can't see, it's very small, is that around 30 percentile, something like that? But their scores are very different. And you can see that the one on the right-hand side scores quite highly in executive functions, but struggles when it comes to divided attention and sustained attention. So that person there is probably likely to get distracted easily in a classroom setting. What we don't have yet with that group is the follow-on scores, because that project is still ongoing. But we did a similar project in a primary school, and this was with younger students. That's very small on screen here, so I'm going to go to the top section first. In a primary school setting, what we had to do was structure their curriculum to give them 30 minutes every day, 5 days a week, 12 weeks. And that helped us get to the 20 hours of training time we needed. You can see some of them did more than others. Pupil J, for example, she was a little superstar. And this was COVID affected. So the bubbles were bursting left, right, and center, but the students could still do this as part of their remote learning because it can be accessed on a smartphone. They don't need to have a laptop. And Pupil J, apparently the mum phoned up the school to complain because the child was using her phone so often to do the games. Now, on average, got to 19 hours, but not all of the students did, but we got close enough. And what I don't have on screen are the initial assessment results for this cohort, because they were fascinating, just like the college students. But the bar chart on the left here shows the cognitive improvements. Now, pupil D improved by 43 percentile points in 12 weeks. Now, that's staggering. Now, they're obviously in the lowest quartile anyway when they started out, but 43 percentile point improvement. This is a 10-year-old. Let's just go back to the active study and suggest that the benefits will still be there with them 10 years into the future. The neuroscientists will say they'll probably be there for longer because these brains, more malleable, all of the neuroplastic adaptations are happening whilst they're still growing and developing at this age. So potentially, this could set that one student on a much better life trajectory because of this early intervention, this 12-week intervention. At first, it was difficult to convince teachers to release them from so much in the mornings, literacy and numeracy time, but they saw the benefits pretty quickly. And this is the key slide. So let me just work out where I am here. Gone backwards. That's the one. So we talk about FAR transfer. So all I've shown so far is that they got better with the assessments and the cognition. But what does that mean in the real world? So 6 of the 12 students in this cohort were in the one classroom, and the teacher said 5 of them pretty quickly noticeable improvements. Behaviour, paying attention, didn't need to explain things multiple times to them. The same teacher provided the quote there on the right-hand side. But it was the English and maths results that were most staggering. And the context here is pretty important. This cohort, they'd been with the teachers for 2 full terms. So they were with them in the summer term, with them in the spring term, the autumn term, so from September through to Christmas, then from January through to Easter. And this trial was in the summer term. So this year, from April through till July. But before our trial started, all of the teachers had to submit their predicted grades for the students. And by this time, they'd spent 2/3 of the year with them. So you'd think that the teachers had a good handle on where you thought those students would land at the end of the year. But surprisingly, in English, half of the students exceeded those teacher expectations. So the teachers were surprised. 4 of them got the grades that the teachers thought they would. And 2 of them, interestingly, didn't. They felt they went backwards. And that's an interesting story as well, which we probably don't have time to go into. Not so significant with maths, but again, 3 of them outperformed the teacher assessed predicted grades. Now, it's not an RCT, there was no control group involved in this, but from a sniff test point of view, which is often what educators go by, they thought something was happening here. And this is one of the reasons why we've got the Institute for Education from UCL, Centre for Education and Neuroscience, and we've got our own PhD student this year expanding on this work, where we are developing it with many more students, and we'll have a lot more hard objective data by this time next year. Now, I'll rattle through things here pretty quickly. And I'll try to leave a little bit of time here for some questions at the end. Helen, I'm hoping that you're still there, and if there are some questions, I may have some time to respond to anything that's come through.
Yes, we do have some questions. So let me, first of all, we have a comment. Nigel said, as a teacher, I'm afraid many of my former colleagues are time poor and have such poor time balance that they are often reluctant to take on board more learning tasks. So a comment there, and we can sympathise with that. Amber has a question. Oh, Amber had a comment as well around the comparison between brain fitness and physical fitness, and she said you can drop the weight but increase the reps to maintain that muscle as well. It's another form of elevation maintaining that is also used. So a question here from Nigel: what are the benefits to those of an advanced age, for example, 60 plus?
Michael is probably the best example of this. He's 77 now, maybe 78. He's one of the smartest people I've ever met, honestly. And so I managed to have the good fortune of spending some time with him at his offices in San Francisco, and he invited me to his lovely vineyard in not far from the Napa Valley for a weekend. And he practices what he preaches. So he's still doing all sorts of things in his spare time. He's got his vineyard, he's got his house, he's got his gardening projects. But his BrainHQ assessment scores are off the scale. So not just age adjusted. And that just shows what can be achieved, not just through software, because that's only half of the battle, but he lives the life as well. So he's doing all of those things that you should be doing, such as the diet, physical exercise, social interaction. There's a lot to be said for social interaction and working with others. So I think Michael has proven, I don't know what his BrainHQ score is. I know there's a talk it's available on YouTube where he does share his BrainHQ profile, and it shows for his age is in like probably the 90th percentile. So definitely benefits for that population. And I think that out in America, that's where most of their consumers and the app purchases come from. It's for some of those reasons there.
Excellent, thank you. So Lucy asks, your recommendation of a 12-week training program with 3 30-minute sessions a week, are there a set of games / courses to follow on the BrainHQ app, or is it personalised?
Oh, that's a great question. So there's different ways of training with BrainHQ. First of all, anyone can download BrainHQ from the App Store. There's a freemium version where you get a different activity from those 29, a different activity each day. But they do encourage you to sign up for the paid version. And I think it's about £60 a year. And it's because there's a lot of work goes into it. It's not an app that stays stable. They're always developing, and they've got that team of neuroscientists doing lots of work. So they do have some costs associated with it. But the beauty of the paid for version is you've got access to something called the personal trainer. And that's where all of the investment has gone with the artificial intelligence, the data and the machine learning. So the personal trainer, what it will do, it will assess your performance in some of these exercises, and it will give you a customized program. And that customized program, it starts with attention and processing speed, because if you don't have good attention and processing speed, things like working memory, cognitive flexibility, executive functions, they will fall down. So that's generic for everybody. But then it personalizes it by giving you exercises where you've got the most room for improvement first. So it'll come up with this personal training schedule, but you do have a way of overriding that as well if you wanted to focus on a specific outcome. So for example, if you wanted to mirror the active study, and it's more of a dementia or a cognitive decline outcome you're trying to focus on, there's a specific set of exercises for that. So from the 29 exercises available, it will focus heavily on maybe 15 of them. And there are other, they're called custom focuses in BrainHQ. So you can select them and you can see what the different options are available to you. So there are some that are focused on high performance, some on memory. There's one around driving, actually, because there are a number of studies about improved driving outcomes. And I think there are some driving organizations in America that have this as part of, it's linked to insurance in America as well, especially as you get a bit older. So there's a custom focus to try and improve driving skills, which is reaction speed, useful field of view, so peripheral vision. So yeah, there are different ways of using BrainHQ once you've got the premium version.
Excellent, thank you. Now, Amber had said, where can you find this? And Marge had already answered and said, I've found it on the App Store. So there you go. People are very interested already, John. Rachel has asked, I was wondering if you had any thoughts on the effect of intermittent fasting on brain health. I
haven't. I do intermittent fasting myself. And to be honest, that's made me feel quite hungry because I'm not eating yet today. But Michael would have a great answer for that. And one of the things that I know I've spoken to him about when it comes to this is stress. And there's a unit in our online course that talks about stress, because one of the most harmful things for the brain is that it's raised cortisol levels. So I think intermittent fasting, if you're good at it, and if it's something that you're already adapted to, I don't think it will be harmful. But if you're struggling, and maybe in the early days when you start an intermittent fasting program, it's going to it's going to raise your cortisol levels. So you need to make sure you offset that with whether it's, I don't know, finding things to do that are going to counteract the effect. So maybe if you are starting an intermittent fasting program, try and do things that are going to take your mind off it, or remove that cortisol feeling from your body, because otherwise it's just going to have a negative impact on your brain. And that's why people experience brain fog and all sorts of associated issues when it comes to not just a new lifestyle intervention like intermittent fasting, but when you start a new drug treatment. I should have mentioned earlier, actually, brain fog. It's when I used to ask Michael about different conditions, and I'd say, would BrainHQ help in this environment, or would it help with this particular situation? And his response is always the same: John, does that user have a brain? If that user has a brain, it will help them. And that's the key thing here, because brain fog is one of the outcomes that's associated with long COVID. And the University of Birmingham in Alabama has just been funded $44 million from the American government to research that. And Michael thinks it's one of the biggest wastes of taxpayers' expense in America, because there's already evidence that suggests that not just BrainHQ, but any related intervention that can address brain fog will have a positive impact. So just because the brain fog is caused by long COVID, it doesn't mean to say that it needs to have a separate research base. Already on the National Institute for Health in America, BrainHQ is listed as an approved intervention following a bout of chemotherapy. If you have brain fog associated with that, I think it's called cancer-related cognitive impairments, CRCI, and menopause as well. I know that's brain fog's associated with menopause as well. So that's something that people are using BrainHQ for. So there's a whole host of different ways it can be used. But my biggest concern in this whole sector is whenever I'm speaking to people in a fairly influential role, let's say within the NHS, the Department for Education, there's a concern about who does it first. I had a very interesting conversation with somebody say, well, if it was that good, it would be made available already and we'd all be using it. And Michael says, John, it'll be when I'm past. I'm 78 now, go faster. He keeps telling me to talk to as many people as I can about this, because it's something which I believe in. But Michael knows that it's not just an objective decision where you look at the evidence base and yeah, that works, it stacks up, so let's start using it. There are some influential factors at play, such as the pharmaceutical industry and why people would rather prescribe a drug where there's a cost involved and a reliance over the rest of your life, as opposed to a 12-week intervention where you could naturally start adjusting some of those neurotransmitter levels. Sorry, Helen, I've gone on a slight tangent there.
No, that's absolutely fine. And that's, I was letting you carry on because it's really interesting. And several people have mentioned on the chat some of the other conditions that brain fog is associated with, such as ME, CSF, fibromyalgia and long COVID. So thank you everyone for sharing. Amber has asked, how can we access the recording of this meeting later? To come back to, absolutely you can, Amber. It will be on the IEP YouTube channel. I will endeavour to get it up by the end of today so you can access it straight away. What I suggest everyone does is if you pop over there and hit subscribe, you will get notifications whenever I upload these webinars. So I'd really recommend that. I have had another question, or two questions actually, from, and I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Lizelle. Can you have two profiles, sort of family sharing on the app?
I don't think you can.
You need separate devices with the app installed.
Yeah, I have two accounts for other reasons, but there was no way of putting them both through the same accounts. And no, I don't think that's possible. But I probably just want to say one extra thing here. Although it is available on the App Store and millions of users and people that download it and work on it individually, Posit Science business model isn't to be a direct-to-consumer business. Lots of the other interventions are, but they work through partners like us at Evolve Education. So it's interesting when they have their partnership meetings, because there's the US government, there's Kaiser Permanente, there's all these interesting groups, and then there's Evolve Education, a small social enterprise from England. But the reason why we work, or they work in the partnership model, is because we have access to group data. So if you wanted to work with BrainHQ with one of your clients, you'd have to rely on them sharing their data with screenshots, or if you're in person, showing you the phone. They don't have a group portal. The only way you can do that is if you work through a partner like Evolve Education. So for example, the data I flashed up on screen earlier, we have access to that because they're our users. So for example, on our management platform, we've got a number of colleges, a number of companies, a number of schools. So we can assign licenses so that the teacher in that school doesn't just see their own score, they see the scores of all of their students as well. So that's why, that's what we're hoping to do. And in partnership with the IEP team, we're trying to make this available to as many providers as possible.
Excellent, thank you. So with that in mind then, how would individuals go about getting in touch with you if they would like to take that approach rather than downloading the app?
Maybe I can share my email address. I'll probably put it in the chat now. It's quite an easy one. I can
certainly, yeah. I mean, I can certainly pass on your email address to anyone who wants to contact myself. So and I can share your email address as well. So that's not a problem whatsoever. So yeah, we would be happy to share that information. Thank you, John. Before we finish then, I'm just aware of the time. It's 2 minutes to, you see, I told you, you've got them interested. And so we've come up, we're nearly at the hour, and I'm aware of people needing to get back to the day job. So do we have any more questions? It's sort of last chance for anyone to ask any questions. And if not, we will close for today's session. I've had lots of people saying this has been really helpful and really interesting. So thank you, John, for that.
It's a pleasure. No, thank you. So great for the opportunity to talk more about this work, because it is quite innovative, and I'm sure for some people it's raised a few eyebrows, because it's something that maybe should be in our consciousness already. So hopefully, if I've got people thinking like that, then that's a success for me.
I would say so. If people are already looking on the App Store while we're still in the session, and I'll admit I've done a bit of a Google and got some more information myself on neuroplasticity while we've been on as well. So you've got us all hooked. So thank you very much for that, John. I look forward to finding out more about it. Lots and lots of thank yous. I won't read them all out, but thank you everyone for coming to today's session. And thank you very much, John, for taking us through. It has been very insightful and enjoyable. And people are saying they will join and have a look at the YouTube presentation. So I've marked those comments, and I promise I will prioritize getting that recording up this afternoon. So thank you for that. Thank you all for spending your lunch time with us. We will close the session now. For those of you who are regulars, and I know there's many with us today, don't forget to join us next week. Oh, excuse me. Next week, we are joined by RNIB, who are taking us through another of the Seeing Opportunities sessions. So it's a good one not to miss. And on the 20th of October, we are joined by Mesma, who are going to be taking us through an introduction to business improvement practices. So I very much look forward to seeing you all there. And thank you all for your time today. It's been a really enjoyable session. Thank you very much.